series, sponsored by the Creative Writing Club, the English Department, the Writing Program, Student Event Allocation, and the Hohenberg Foundation. And Cary, Holladay, director. Launched in 1977, the River City Writing Series is celebrating its 36th year. Tonight we are delighted to host the poet Mary Leigh. Next month, fiction writer Leigh K. Abbott, and in February, fiction writer Leigh Smith. All events are free and open to the public. It's a real pleasure to welcome Mary Leigh back to Memphis. Many of you remember her as a teacher, colleague, and friend from her years teaching in our creative writing program, and as the long-term editor of River City, our literary journal, now The Pinch. Mary came to poetry in an unusual way. She practiced law for many years and served as the Assistant State Attorney General for Oklahoma, and later as referee for the Supreme Court of Oklahoma. She received her MFA in poetry from the Warren Wilson Program for Writers, and she left the law for her PhD in literature at Brandeis University. She has remarked that her first poem was called Probate. Her first book of poems, Red Signature, won the National Poetry Series in 1996. Her second volume, The Penultimate Suitor, won the Iowa Poetry Prize in 2001. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in the Beloit Poetry Journal, American Poetry Review, Southern Review, and other journals. Her poetry has been featured on National Public Radio, both on Weekend Edition and on Garrison Keillor's Writer's Almanac. Her career includes teaching positions at Warren Wilson, Emory University, and Louisiana State University. She's now a professor at Purdue University, teaching courses in the writing and craft of poetry at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Her latest book, Beyond the Fire, came out recently from the British publisher Shearsman Press. Her growing body of work celebrates mothers and daughters, the mysteries of self-reflection, the beauty of the natural world, and the cyclical aspects of family life. The bookstore has copies of her books for sale, and she will sign them for you after the reading. Tomorrow she'll be interviewed on the craft of poetry, and her work in particular, by MFA students at 10:30 a.m. in Patterson 456. Please welcome our valued friend and colleague back to Memphis, which she long called home, Mary Leigh.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out. What did you say about the babbling? What was that phrase? You had a great phrase that you said. I'll get you to give me that piece of paper later. But first of all, in planning this reading, I took the occasion of coming back to Memphis to look for poems that have something to do with looking back. And what I plan to do is to make a kind of a warp and a weave out of a warp with the threads going this way from my new book, and then a weave using new poems. And to launch this weaving metaphor, I want to begin with a poem called Among Things Held at Arm's Length. And I'm going to press John and Cary into serving as readers for the parts. The frame is, at the top it says, Father, Mother, in engraved letters. This is a gravestone. Father, Mother, married February 14, 1947. The location, Pawnee, Oklahoma. First we will hear Father, then we will hear Mother, and then I will read the poem in a woven form. Father.
Joe Hauser Privet, July 29, 1921, January 22nd, 1996. He was a good sport and his hair was red. When plaque broke loose in arteries and caused stroke, he would call plaque flat. That's how he perceived it. He had a Purple Heart. When he was a kid, 13 and 14, hour days on the tractor, meant he got sunburned, badly, even dangerously, right through his shirt. When he put these two things together, talking to his daughter, which time frame was he in? They thought I was going to die, said solemnly, like a child.
Catherine Jo Haddox Privet, May 29, 1924 to January 22, 1995. My children were English-speaking islands from her diary. Like years later, reading lines I wrote so unfamiliar, I think amazed, how did I come on that? From one of her poems. I think even when light dies, stands a break, and the bones of the stars are piled up in cairns in the sea, a part of me will not be old, from another of her poems. How did she come on that?
Jo Hauser Privet, Catherine Jo Haddox Privet, July 29, 1921, January 22, 1996, May 29, 1924, January 22, 1995. He was a good sport, and my children were. His hair was red, English-speaking islands. When plaque broke loose from her diary in arteries and caused stroke, he would call, like years later, reading plaque, flack. That's how lines I wrote so unfamiliar, he perceived it. I think, amazed, he had a Purple Heart. How did I come on that? When he was a kid, from one of her poems, 13 and 14 hour days on the tractor, I think even when light dies meant he got sunburned, stanza break, badly, even dangerously, and the bones of the stars right through his shirt are piled up in cairns. When he put these two in the sea, things together, talking, no stanza break, to his daughter, which, a part of me, time frame was he in? Will not be old. They thought I was going to die, from another of her poems, said solemnly, like a child. How did she come on that? And this idea of a person being old and having something come back from when they were a child is a theme increasingly in my poems, including this sonnet. It's called Death of a Gypsy. It's on page 27, Catherine.
Thank you.
You being a reader there. Good, you can follow the scheme. Death of a Gypsy. A woman of the winds anticipates bartering old harmonies for sheep, sheep for wool, wool for cloth, cloth for paraphrase, common language for a spell of Godspeed. Trade, trade, trade until she coins. Redundance is not possible, but repetition is. She gets caught outside in the thunder, departs like lightning with the last vision. The morning star, soaked with feeling derived from rivers of cobalt-glazed pottery, points to the caravan she has outlived as it loops back. She has not forgotten her skilled mother next to her young uncle. La, pink and gray, there, the first cathedral. I'm interested in this idea of a figure like a gypsy who is not exactly a character, doesn't have a name, but is a kind of a figure. And the next poem I want to read is called Obeisance. I'm interested in these figures who are kind of on the edges of things, not in positions of power. This is as if spoken by someone who is like a personal servant to a rich lady. Here's what she has to say about her position of obeisance. And she too is old, and there's a moment when she remembers something. It galls me to sew for a mistress who has no fashion sense, to dress her hair as directed in ways that do nothing for her face, which is twice as long as it is wide and bony. It galls me to pick up dropped hairpins by stooping, too arthritic to perform a graceful down on bended knee. And what is more, having seen what happens when a person has a stroke, I know that a worse time is coming when some small thing dropped on the floor will simply have to stay there accusatory until someone else comes along. When my Thomas first died, I would use up all my half day at his grave spot, just filling him in on the news. But then time would not permit, then weather would prevent, and then, well, sunken. The time's already come when even in bed the pain persists. I have had to learn to sleep on my back rather than my side. When I rest, I find that crooking one knee up helps to relax that half of the pelvis, then I switch. What a blunt club each knee now is, held at the angle of a fishing pole. If only, when unable to sleep, I'd think over my good deeds. When I was to share my bed with a great aunt visiting, I said, I always sleep without a pillow. Really? She said. Really, I said, because then I can stretch my back out flat. One knows how to add verisimilitude to one's lies. The reason I said it was so that the poor old lady could both save face and have two pillows, a luxury she was used to. But instead, I lie awake and worry about whether in the morning I will still manage to catch my urine in a pint jar. And for another pair, I'm going to mention that when I was a teacher here, I was always encouraging my students to take anything taught by Josh Phillips, anything taught by Catherine Martin, to take the old literature classes. And finally, what student said, I think I'm old literatured out. I'm just going to take Theron. But in any case, I've picked for Catherine an Adam and Eve poem. It's called Bit from Possible Origin of Punch and Judy. Now, the Punch and Judy were the puppets from England, and Punch was always beating up on. He'd say, Judy, Judy, and she would come out and go, and then everyone would laugh hilariously. So this is a possible origin of Punch and Judy. Adam meets Eve, and before he even hears her side of the story, he gives her up to the prosecution. Then he turns his back on her, tossing behind him a too small fig leaf, muttering, cover yourself. She puts the leaf in front of her face. That always gets a big laugh. Bit of a bitter poem. And I'm pairing that one, reading that one, with another poem that has some old school feeling to it, called Remember Adam's Fall. That title and the refrains that you will hear, because really this is a song, which really should be sung, is from a carol written by a man named Thomas Ravenscroft, who lived from 1592 to 1635. And it refers to Corbies, which is an old school word. It's a famous poem called the Trois Corbies. It's for blackbirds, or ravens, crows. Remember Adam's fall. Salt-stained hard leathern vests of archers next to next. Remember, O thou man, thy time is spent. Buildings of darkest size, flame-bound and blocking sight. Remember God's goodness, be not afraid. Hard marching yielded sway, winter's old right of way. Remember, O thou man, thy time is spent. Sudden freeze, melding feet, shelter too far to seek. Remember God's goodness, be not afraid. Even the king's body lies merely rime-shielded. Remember, O thou man, thy time is spent. Wood cross will molder soon, rock lichens fetter tombs. Remember God's goodness, be not afraid. Sharp corbies keep alert dominion over earth. Remember, O thou man, thy time is spent. The thought in amber held where light would once upwell. Remember God's goodness, be not afraid. This is a very short poem called Husbandry, and it's a dialogue. Honey, I think maybe we should move this coleus. Honey? What? I said, I think we might want to move this coleus. Okay. Because I know it said partial sun or partial shade or whatever, but I just don't think it lights behind that rock. I said, okay. And another poem that has got a couple and also some produce, like plants. A market day at the end of April. The chimes stir even the misanthrope. His hearse of a mind gives like a sieve in a shower. He finds himself buying lettuce, damp, and in a deeper stall, dried saffron. He carries them home all in a green sack, leaves it for his wife to find once she is back from her meeting. Then he repairs to his shed in the back. He thinks he is changing. She finds the sack, and she thinks she must look different. The lettuce taken out, the saffron, tell her he thinks he feels the darkness abating. In the winter, pears, the plural of writing. In the spring, fingers, the plural of work. A history bestows its commonality. Smith, he a Robert, she a Pilar. Hand trimmers passed into drama on guitar, but were useless on harp. Lorry, having as root lurry, to pull, meant not just any horse, but one built large and low. And this next poem weaves together 3 different voices, all heard by me at a poetry reading in Norman, Oklahoma when I was first starting to write. The title of the poem is 3 People Who Broke Their Hearts from Bewilderment. There's another writer named Mary Leader who wrote a book called Triad, from which Stevie Nicks got the song Rhiannon, or whatever. How's that, Stevie Nicks? Rhiannon? Is that what it is? Anyway, that Mary Leader is not me, unfortunately. I have gotten some fan mail from her for her, but she did have in the book called Triad, which is it's a supernatural ghost story kind of thing. She had the Irish and the Welsh had everything in 3s. So she has a little quote from one of the old bards that said, 3 people who broke their hearts from bewilderment. And that's what I picked up from my title. It also has an epigraph with a little line at the beginning, which is mon panache, or my feather, my flare, which is the final line in Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand. So this is my panache. And each reader has got an introduction. Featured speaker at Poetry Festival in Norman, Oklahoma. Tall black man listening to his famous late father's voice on tape, often closes his lips and nods yes, and afterwards, after the applause for the tape has died down, weaves remarks and quotations, some of which are as follows. The man, the note says Melvin B. Tolson, was just magnificent. My father wrote long poems. The son and nephew of preachers and scholars, and acts of lightning, great God Almighty, like a bear on fire. Some say he was born in Georgia, some say in Alabama. Open mic reader who acknowledges schizophrenia as her disease. Pale girl in black velvet hat with large white plume atop spiky bleached hair does indeed read with trembling hands and with intercoiled facial confusion and without tears and without suppression of tears, her poem whose closure goes, she called me a dumbass, but I forgive her because she's a stupid human who knows very little, if anything. Open mic reader who explains that her maiden name was Innes, old white lady, whose unmarried name, she may or may not know this, means island in Irish. When introducing her poem by relating an encounter between herself returning home after many years and, quote, a little old black man on the road, close quotes, uses the latter's speech, points as evidently he had done in the event. That there's Innes' place, and adding, we called him Captain, and yes sir, I mean yes ma'am. We'd see that green, and we'd say, them's George Innes' alfalfa fields. And she, quoting that, has her voice suspended by emotion, but She doesn't break down and cry until she arrives at the very last of the phrases that are actually in her poem, "Wild plums on the ground there for our savoring." And the last two poems I read are, I'm going to read are multi-paged. So the first is called Patronymic. That's, the patronymic is a Russian tradition of taking a name from the father, and so that's called, patra, like paternal, and mimic, like name. Patronymic. No sighted person hasn't been affected by the action of wind on some kind of banner, streamer, flag, wind-socked piece of fishing line left after a wind chime has gotten knocked down or taken down or been blown down off of its hook under the eaves, or on branches bare and branches bearing leaves, such as sycamore, plum, black locust, scrub oak, and branches bearing needles and cones, such as red cedar, cedar of Lebanon, spruce. No hearing person hasn't been affected some time or other by the sound of wind, of. Many have not remarked being affected thus. Dad, I still have the brown and white banded feather I found out of the old barn. The barn, vacated now, I remember his description of the heat coming off the galvanized aluminum siding, or was it tin, when he, alongside his brothers, nailed it to the frame their father had designed and constructed. A natural engineer, third-grade education, but he could do our algebra problems. He couldn't tell you how he got the answer, but he always got it right. That barn had, indeed has, a self-supporting roof. Fire took the four-square house this grandfather of mine popped to his kids, likewise designed and built with the boys' help, the girls bringing iced tea. Out in the country like that, once the town's one fire truck runs out of water, at least it didn't spread to the barn, nor to the silo. I took the feather to the hospital to show my father one of the last times I saw him on this earth. Look, Dad, I found this out of the old barn. Do you know what kind it is? See, because by then there was so little under his command, I thought it would be good to ask him things I knew. Amount in bushel, gallon, peck, the steps in bringing in the wheat, terms, names of the different implements, harrow, hane, owl. He was never one to make a big deal over nature. He was glad he could provide the answer, though. I, in a rapid speech pattern I learned from my mother and her mother, kept on. What kind of owl, Dad? Like a barred owl or a barn owl? Just owl, he said. Just owl, he said, I think. But as I've been working on this poem forever, keyboard slippage left of F or keyboard slippage right, wind or wing, father coming out, gather. It could be that only here does he say, just owl. And in the actual air says something like, I don't know, sugar. Yet sensitive to me, as always, might be some kind of an owl. His highest praise to me came when I'd made something with materials. Why, you're just as handy as a pocket on a shirt. His harshest criticism, don't be that way, was for when I was unhappy. Adults used to say, spitting image of her daddy, ain't she? And smart as a whip, or sharp as a tack. And to him, hello, Joe, what do you know? Did you just get back from Kokomo? Some see no need to remark being affected by a windswept field of vetch, or by a lone persimmon tree, or by, down a ways, rainy ditches with their cattails with their red-winged blackbirds' calls, emanations from the well-tempered shoulders. And I'll close with a poem called Sweet William. It also has an epigraph, but the epigraph comes in after the poem's already gotten started. It interrupts the poem, because that's when I thought of it. The poem, you'll recognize it when it comes in because it starts out 6 chords. It's from a Thomas Hardy poem called 6 Chords, one of my favorites. Sweet William. The link here is that it's the same barn. Sweet William, had I said yes, he'd have been true. The day he proposed, we were out in the old barn on my dad's folks' place, and the weather was still cool, Spring break, was it? We were in our own world and in a literal hayloft. 6 boards belong to me. I do not know where they may be, if growing green or lying dry in a cockloft nigh. Some morning I shall claim them. Thomas Hardy, yes. Bill had gotten a deferment from the draft and was starting medical school that fall. Which fall? 1968. In the hayloft, though chaste, I said, tell me a story. Once upon a time, he said, a boy from McAllister, Oklahoma, fell in love with a little red-haired girl from Pawnee, Oklahoma. Later, Bill, who had never been on a horse before in his life, nonetheless took his place in the saddle. He had donned my black and white serape from Argentina. He seemed a natural, as out and out he rode, a woolen wind flapping free behind him, all rhythm in the gallop across gentle pasture land. I wish now I had at least given him the black and white blanket. If not at the time, then much later, when we spoke by phone, do you remember that day I started? And he knew at once which one. He said, that was one of the best days of my whole life. I said, I couldn't believe you had never ridden a horse before. He said, I was inspired by your serape. What was wrong with me? Why didn't I box it up and mail it to him the next day? Maybe I didn't know where it was in the complex household I'd acquired by then, with my husband and our kids. Or maybe something told me not to, given that he by then had a wife and kids. I don't know. Now on my own with fewer possessions, I have it in sight. Should I box it up, mail it tomorrow? He is not, so far as I know, dead. But when, later again, I called, is Bill there? Who is this? An old friend from college. You don't know? Then I learned how a congenital aneurysm burst, blasted to smithereens, not Bill Power's whole body, but both his prefrontal lobes. Seats, according to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, of learning, behavior, and the emotions. Group home. He can walk a little. Diapers. He was a quarter Choctaw and had their straight hair and shy bearing. With long brown fingers, he played the piano. Malagueña, Claire de Lune. Does he, I asked the woman he'd settled on as second choice, still love his music? No, she said, no, that's all. So.
How would you describe a married leader poem?
You know, I'm mostly driven by the rhythm, which may come as a surprise if you've seen other pages of my book, because there are all kinds of pictographs and poems that can't be read because they're not in sentences and they're letters in shape, like a sampler on a page. I've got poems like that. But I think that the rhythms, you know, I think that hearing music, hearing people talk, those are always the things that get me going. At least lately. And I think maybe those are well springs. That there's and another word that describes my work is experimental, which I proudly, you know, claim as pushing the ideas of what a poem can be. I just think of them as pieces of paper. Yes.
When they vibrate, this kind of a picture poem, are you riffing on Herbert or?
Well, partly Herbert, of course. You know, because he's the one that has the famous poem called Easter Wings, that as the idea goes in and becomes thin, Herbert says to God that even though he's only immortal, if he will imp his imping, and I love technical terms too, like the names for implements and the names, the history of words. If he will imping was a word for putting on, you know, they had those hunting falcons. And to make them fly better, they would insert, like super glue or glue gun, extra wings into their feathers so that they could soar even better. So Herbert proposes that if he would imp himself to God, if God would imp George Herbert's wings on Easter, which he believed God did, then he too could fly. And so it's shaped in wings. He has others that are known as like an altar. And it is in keeping with the whole tradition of emblem poems And I'm interested in those because they were books written for ordinary folks. And there would be a title and then a little engraving of some kind of motto, like a saying, and then a little poem. And people had, they were like coffee table books in the Renaissance. They were bougie. I mean, shopkeepers had them as well as learned people. They weren't good poems, though. But there are examples of women taking the motifs, the little pictures, and using them as embroidery. Unable to read the text, they nonetheless could use the book. So I'm interested in ways of representing illiteracy, which is not stupidity. For most of history, most people have not been taught to read. And the idea that a piece of paper can be like a piece of cloth. Number one, beautiful. Number two, useful. Number three, meaningful. I try to push that so that it doesn't even have to be read, it's perceived a priori as those things by looking at it on the page. So yeah, in the tradition of the emblem books and other visual poetry, little puzzles of language. I've done a lot of studies on visual poetry. So yeah, Herbert, but then also specifically this feminist idea of linen. You know, the word linen comes in line. It's the same word. And the linnet, the bird that eats the flaxseed, as a kind of an emblem for the singing bird. Which women, it's always figured female, like Philomela. So yeah, I put a lot of theory. I don't have much of a personal life, so I put a lot of theory into what I think about in terms of writing, what I can think up to do. And that's what I mean by experimental. I don't necessarily say that those are great poems, or even that they're poems, but I think they're interesting pieces of paper, and they say something that I don't think has been said quite so demonstratively, as opposed to essayistically. That satisfied morbid curiosity? Nosy Parker?
No. There's a new book out on the history of feathers. That's the most amazing evolutionary development among species. You would like it.
I think I would. Anything else you're curious about?
What incongruities or similarities do you find between poetry and law?
Oh, that's an excellent question. People will say, wow, what a switch. But to me, again, on the theoretical level, on the way that law cases sound and the way that poetry sounds, they don't sound alike. There's very little rhythm in the law. But what there is in the law, that I believe that there also is in poetry, is that category called performative language. Language that changes the status of persons, one to another, and to their group. My favorite example is if somebody says, do you like the weather? And you say, I do. I like it. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. You don't affect the weather. You don't perform the weather by saying that. But if you're in front of a priest or a rabbi, and you've just been asked, do you take this woman, do you take this man, and you say, I do, then you've got a shitload of credit card debt you didn't have before. That has changed. It has changed. It's language that changes status. And that's what poetry at its most ambitious does. If we are technicians of language, we change the language, we change the world. And that's not by writing necessarily poems that everybody in the world can understand necessarily, but it is by putting pressure on the organ of language, and so that lawyers, that they have to use a word so that it will go out so far, but then stop. It will have, what lawyers call bright lines. It will end what's constitutional and unconstitutional. There will be a bright light between them. A poet will use a word like horse and want it to go out so far, or use feathers and want it to go out and invoke a certain amount of material, but it can't be streetlights. There's a point at which it must be what it is. So the naming function of law and poetry, the performative function, that's where I see, and that I think is what Shelley meant by calling poets the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Lawmakers language makers and lawmakers, the logos. It's the same, for me it's the same thing. I'm better at writing poems than I am as a lawyer, I should tell you. So, but that's a good question.
Well said.
I used to say in class that
Hey, Mary Burns!
that rhyming, like rhyming poems, tells us something about relationships and things in the world. And I think like you seem to be very interested in the poet's mind and the way, because the speaker in your poem is very clever, and it seems like you're very interested in how the poet is creating these relationships to where the attention is being drawn, and pausing on it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you think that that's true? I mean, 'cause I don't know. Sometimes I just giggle just at the ideas that come up.
Yes, and I do think it's a huge place for intellect and wit in poetry. It's something that hasn't, that it had a kind of an epitome during what used to be called the Age of Reason. When the heroic couplets was the dominant form. But people look back at that and think it's like Alexander Pope. They think it's, oh, that's so old school. We can't possibly write that way now. And it's true, we can't sound that way now. Because using heroic couplets, it involves torquing the language so that the natural syntax that we've come to expect goes away in order to get the rhyme. And that's now a no-no. But people don't realize that there was earth-shattering changes. It was the age of newspapers. It was the first time that poets brought something besides nature. It was, well, that's not entirely true, but bringing the personal details, the personal autobiographical details of the poet's life into poetry was a fairly new thing. Am I right, you scholars? That when he puts in there about how his mother likes broccoli and how his mother casts an eye when she's dying. That's in the famous epistle letter to his friend Dr. Arbuthnot. A great culture of friendship, and poetry was an organ of friendship. It performed friendship, and it made friendships in language. People would send these poems to each other off and on, and so that those skills and those things that were happening are equally important with poetry that sounds much more contemporary. So I'm going back to the little moment you said about rhyme, because that's what I'm currently most interested in. And I've got a student, a Warren Wilson student, who writes rhyming poetry. And so he's reading Pope. I've never gotten a student to read Pope before. So, but that wasn't exactly what you were saying. You're talking more about the wit angle, because that's where wit was highly valued.
Yeah, I think I was talking more about just in general how it seems that with the relationship of what the speaker in your poem seems to be, it's not always rhyming, but I think there is rhyming. I haven't read it, but I'm sorry. But in your other.
Well, off and on. I don't have a whole book of rhyming.
I was just saying in general, though, it seems like the speaker is interested in the relationship between, the objects or the ideas or.
Mm-hmm. And yes, and a rhyme is an idea, putting two words together because they happen to sound alike, and then teasing the mind to think, what does that tell us? I had this conversation about rhyme with my friend Reginald Gibbons, and he had written uncharacteristically for him, as for most contemporary poets, a rhyming poem, and he rhymed. Tune was the word he was going to have to rhyme. So, first word he decides not to rhyme with tune is wound. That's hackneyed. It's dripping with irony. We go from the wound to the tune. That is dull, and it's not at all fresh. No one's interested in thinking about that relationship because we've already had all those thoughts. So he rhymed tune with plume. Speaking of feathers, and the idea of something being buried and immobilized forever, and then a plume which rises and can shift in the wind. Or think of plumes on helmets or plumes on any kind of on birds or on wearing apparel. That's much more interesting. The relationship of tomb and plume is interesting. The relationship of tomb and wound is not. Tomb and plume is also a better rhyme because it's not spelled the same way. The skill in rhyming comes in having the sounds be the same, but the way it's spelled, the part of speech, the place in the syntax, all being different. This is now I'm teaching. So, but that level of ideation, I'm interested in that. And I also think it's interesting that speaker is the word that you've been taught, and everybody, and I do it too, everyone calls the person who says the poem the speaker. That was not always so. That it was not ever thus. That's because Pound and the other modernists believe that a poem is only as good as it is dramatic. They were interested in persona poems, dramatic monologues, in theater, in drama. And that is, a lyric poem doesn't have a speaker. It doesn't even have a singer. It just exists as a song. It aspires to anonymity. And that's very different than the idea of who is the speaker in the poem. So all of these assumptions that we have about poetry that are based in time and place, I'm always interested in the fissures and in disrupting those places. So you know that already. Mary Burns is one of the most talented people I've ever met there. Yes, Josh?
Can you talk a little about humor in your poetry? Because I noticed this much more when you were giving your reading and when I just talked to you, but there's a fair amount of humor, and there's, it made me think, I can't remember what theorist said this, but there's one theorist who says, every joke or every bit of humor is conservative, right? Because it dispels the tension. And there are moments in your poetry where it kind of ends on a little bit of a joke, and it feels that maybe that's happening. And I wonder how you feel about
That humor is inherent. Well,
it's conservative because what's happening is that two things are being put in tension. That tension is productive, but what humor does is it kind of lets everybody off, right?
Yeah.
Because you laugh, and then the tension is gone, but the contrast or the contradictions are not resolved, right? It's just that you laughed away.
Yeah, right. I can see that. But I also think there are, if I weren't tired, I could probably think of more instances where humor is in fact subversive. Where, it's in kind of the laugh or cry school, that if you can make somebody, that humor can have barbs and hidden, that you can get away with as a kind of a disguise. A clown can get away with things that are not allowed, like crying in public, the clown that has the tear hanging on there. So I wonder if that, but I also can see what you mean, that because if it dispels the tension, then that's the end of discussion. But I don't think that exhausts the whole history of humor, or certainly its purposes from
No,
now on.
and I, in fact, I was less pursuing the sort of a theory of humor than how you feel humor works in your poetry.
Well, that's a tough question. I've never been asked it, because sometimes I think I don't know. So people will, for one thing, people will laugh when I did not intend humor. That happens. Maybe that dispels tension in a way that, and if I'll say something, that I think is hilariously funny. I think that Adam and Eve poem is really funny. When she puts the
Well, that was what
over her face, and but did anybody laugh? No. My friend, my attorney friend Arlene, she will say, "That's very funny." I said, "Well, then why are you laughing?" "That's very funny." She'll articulate, "That's very funny." "Well, then you should be laughing." So I don't have much control. It's probably a good thing. I don't have much control over whether it's funny or not. I do think that the culture of hearing poems in poetry readings, which is also relatively new, causes poets to write differently. Like I purposely had on my list, but decided not to read a poem that's full of quotation marks, so it would be hard for you to know when one person is speaking and the other person is speaking, so I just kind of skipped it off my list. Because I'd have to be going like this, and then it's a page poem, in other words. It's a page poem, not a stage poem. And if people see somebody up here, like I've heard people say about Tony Copeland, "That guy is so fucking funny," as the highest possible praise you could give a poet. And that makes me grit my teeth, because I also think poetry is absolutely serious at the same time. And to say, and it gets conflated in my mind with crowd-pleasing poetry. which I'm not interested in. So I'm going to think some more about this humor thing. Yeah. Yes.
With the statement that you just made that you're not interested in pleasing the crowd necessarily, what would you say the goal is when you write? Like, what is your own personal purpose?
Well, that gets into ideas of, are you thinking of ideas of audience, like who do you write for and what are you thinking of? And my advice is to fall into unrequited love, because that gets a lot of emotions going, plus you have a lot of time. So that's a good combination. And when I'm in a state of unrequited love, which has been one of my fates, I write for that person. I write to get that person's attention, even if they never see the poem. Sometimes they do, actually. But I write for that person. Like, oh yeah? What about, you know, so I'm getting justice. I mean, I'm thinking of the space of the poem as a place for compensatory action. When the world has united, my whole dissertation is about the denial of basic human rights to workers that happened in the 1930s. And Muriel Rukeyser wrote a book called The Book of the Dead, using the voices of the workers, and it provides a jurisdiction, a place where law is spoken beyond the courts of law, which we're not able to deal with. Where, you know, they didn't do the right suit, and they brought the wrong claim. They should have brought you know, workers' comp when they instead brought negligence, and vice versa. Blah blah blah, a bunch of technical stuff. So the space of poetry then can possibly become compensatory. So if some little injustice in my life, I've never been discriminated against in the workplace like that I know of, but you know, I fall in love with people who don't fall in love with me, and so I use that space to talk to them and to set the record straight. But that's a kind of a minority of my poems. Other times, I usually think of very specific people. Certain poems, I'm writing for my own children right now. And my friend Arlene has got a daughter who didn't finish school, you know, got pregnant, does meth, blah, blah, blah. She says, you know, write for Karen. And there are certain poems that Karen can get, and so I write those poems too. But that's a little different from pleasing somebody, because I don't write to please Karen, I write to honor Karen. So I suppose that the different poems have different meanings and different audiences and different times I have different ideas. But I've never, that I can think of, written a poem that I expect an audience to like. If they do, I'm just kind of surprised and pleased. And if they don't, well, then I don't care. Not very much. I mean, this was the advantage of starting so late. I was nearly 40 before I ever began to write at all. And so I never had the fear. I never cared what anybody thought. If I started writing when I was your age, I would have cared so much what people thought. I would have been paralyzed. So that's why I became a lawyer. So and did other things. But I was lucky to come late to writing, because I have a certain inconsequential, you know, it's not a boast, I'm just not afraid. Okay, I think that about wraps it up.